lost my voice. The whole beginning of it sounded very chatty. Yeah, I lost my voice that day. I was like, really? And all of a sudden it just was gone. And I was like, I was whispering to Destiny. Yeah.
Okay, let's get rolling today. I know we have a number of folks who are traveling this weekend. We're a smaller group and it seems like it's been a long week. So we'll try to keep things pretty smooth and straightforward in working through our last theory of the week. So we'll be talking about communication accommodation theory here in just a minute. Just working through some new things to know. The slides, I accidentally linked them for the next week. So if you look at relational dialectics, if you're using a device, today's slides are under that one. So I'll move it back later. All right. So we'll be hearing in just a little bit from Haley, who will talk us through a bit about communication accommodation theory. We only have a few more presentations left. So getting into next week, we have a full week of 3. That'll be our last full week. And then with Memorial Day and some classes where we're not meeting, we'll just have 2 more presentations after that. So we're definitely getting pretty close to the end here in some of the remaining theories. As we're working through theories at this stage, I highly recommend that you really start thinking about the ones that are especially interesting or have jumped out to you as candidates for your second application. Because any theory past the 4th week is a candidate that you can use for that assignment. So we'll talk, we heard last class from Kate Kevin and media ecology theory, right? This idea that media has this really pervasive major role in our lives in shaping how we think about the world. There's a famous phrase by Marshall McLuhan that we talked about last class. What was that sentence? Angela?
The medium is the message.
Yes. So McLuhan's famous phrase is this idea that the medium, right, how a message is delivered basically shapes what that message is. So whether you're using a TV show, social media, snail mail, like that medium profoundly affects what that message is and how that message works, right? So that's a key idea here in thinking about this theory. For today, once we hear from Haley, I'll do a little activity that will help you in some of the brainstorming and thinking for your second application paper. And we'll discuss a little bit more regarding communication accommodation theory. So Haley, you have the floor. I went ahead and downloaded your slides or your PDF slides. So I'll have those. And you can play around with it if you want to. What I can do then is I can actually zoom it into the house. If you're welcome, I would recommend you could scroll down here on the right side, or also click on the certificate.
I'm going to talk about communication accommodation theory. Okay, so I just put some really general basics so you guys have understanding for the examples that I'm going to cover. So this theory looks at the conscious and unconscious ways that people tend to adjust or not adjust their communication when talking to others. The main assumption is basically that speakers, when they interact, they modify their speech, vocal patterns, and gestures to accommodate for the people they're speaking to. It was developed by Howard Gills, and it used to be known as speech accommodation theory, but was expanded to include nonverbal communication in that speaking pattern. Okay, so I came up with 6 different examples. The first one was one out of the textbook, conversational echo, when someone repeats both verbal and nonverbal communication from earlier in the communication. Slang is another form of an example. So if you meet a new group of friends and their vocabulary doesn't quite match with yours, but then within a few days, your vocabulary looks very much like theirs. My personal example is I don't have a lot of friends in my major. So when I talk to my friends about my major, I'm commonly overly explaining concepts that were there so I could talk to them and they can still understand what that concept is. Slowing or speeding up the rate or pace of your words when you're talking to someone. So talking super fast and then it looks like they're getting lost, so you slow down your rate of talking. Common terms, if you're talking to another college kid, you might use prereqs, gen eds, things that any college kid would know. But then talking to someone who hasn't gone to college, you might give examples of what those are or use different terms altogether. And then something that was also kind of in the textbook was if you're talking to someone and you're bilingual and they look very uncomfortable in the first language, but you know the second language that they're more comfortable in, you might change the conversation to be in that language altogether. Okay, and then why it matters, I have 4 different reasons. So convergence is when you choose to adapt to accommodate that second person. And that can shed light on why people adapt their interactions. And then another reason would be why people choose not to adapt. So there's another term that will probably be gone over in more details later, which is divergence, which is when you choose not to adapt. And that kind of helps us understand why people may choose to ignore adapting strategies. And it's not always like to be rude. I was practicing with someone and they were like, why wouldn't you adapt? That sounds really rude. And I was like, I promise, there's reasons that aren't rude. And then third one is it helps us out understanding. It helps us just understand the culture around us better and the influence of accommodation on diverse relationships within society. Because especially in the chapter in the textbook, it's talking a lot about differences across cultures. And then the fourth one was complexity. This theory helps us understand more about why and how communication is complex.
Thank you so much, Haley. I thought that you did a great job here of helping us to think about communication accommodation theory and providing us a lot of examples of why it matters and is relevant. I like your example about slang and communicating like to other folks in college. You use a lot of language like prereqs and so on, based on a shared understanding of meaning. But that would be very different if we were talking to somebody that has not had a college experience or hasn't in a very long time. You also did a great job here of helping us think about ideas of respect as it relates to convergence and accommodation too. Back in a lot of cultures and situations, right? We naturally adapt and adjust the way that we communicate based on the needs of other people. If we, for example, are talking to somebody that's deaf or hard of hearing, right? We might make sure that they can hear and see us because a lot of folks don't use lip reading and so on, right? So there's a lot of elements that go into that as well. And I really like the way that you were providing these thoughtful, engaged examples here about communication that in many ways we do every day, right? So communication accommodation theory is one of those theories that I think describes something that is such a major part of our lives, and yet is something that we oftentimes do without giving it a second thought. The ways that we make minor adjustments or changes to our rate of delivery without even thinking about it, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but I do want to give you the chance to do a little bit of brainstorming for today. So as a reminder, if you check on the expectations and assignment description for the second application paper, it lists out the theories that are candidates for that second paper. So the candidates for that second paper are any of the ones that we talked about past the 4th week of the term. So the possible theories that you could draw from for this assignment include communication privacy management, groupthink, organizational culture, rhetoric, dramatism, narrative paradigm, media ecology, and communication accommodation theory, as we'll be talking about for today. So we've gone over several of these. We'll have a few more that we'll talk about in the next couple weeks that are also options But based on what we thought about so far, I want you to consider a theory or two that have really jumped out at you as a possible candidate for this assignment. And what I want you to do is to take a little bit of time to reflect on and think ahead. First of all, what went well for you in the process of developing that first application? Maybe it was an aha moment or a way that you feel like you connected a theory to the artifact really well. And what are some of the things that you feel like you still need to work on for that paper in terms of how it's structured, things that were little snags in that process, and so on. Then I want you to think about which theories especially stood out to you that we talked about that could be candidates for that second paper. You know, maybe you already have a theory set, or you think, this communication accommodation theory thing is interesting. And then lastly, I'd like you to just take a little bit to think about some possible artifacts that you might explore for the second application. You're not married to any of these, whether it's the theory or the artifacts, but I do want you to have the chance to start to think about what might be a good option here. You take about 2 or 3 more minutes to continue brainstorming this, and I'm not going to ask to grab this until the end. So if ideas come up later, that's totally fine, and you're welcome to jot those down. I also store all of the attendance activities just for records. So if you ever find that you want to go back to any of the ideas or anything, just let me know, and I can always hand you back if you had an idea that came up. I had somebody last week who had an idea that they wanted to reference back in their attendance. So I can always get you that back. You go ahead and finish what you're currently working on. No, it's a Friday the 13th, which is considered unlucky. But a new Kendrick album and new Black Keys album came out today, so I'm really excited to hear those later. All right. So hopefully this gives you a little bit to draw from and start to think about. Again, this essay is going to be due on the 25th, and my goal is to get you feedback and comments on your first application paper by the end of this week. And just as a reminder, if you're feeling really behind and having a bit of a rough time, just let me know if you need an extension related to this assignment. I'm happy to help facilitate that. All right, so let's talk about communication combination theory, right? So otherwise known as CAT, which is kind of fun. So Haley did a great job here at helping us think about some practical examples and ways that this theory is used. Again, we accommodate all the time without thinking about it. Whether there's a relative that we're speaking up for who has some difficulty with hearing, or whether it's talking to a young child and maybe sounding more enthusiastic and varied in our voice, right? Or talking to a pet and giving them goofy names in a silly voice too, right? This idea that we modify how we communicate to accommodate or address the needs of other people is a crucial element of this theory, right? This is interpersonal, but it also examines some of the social elements and cultural elements of how we adjust and adapt our communication. I have a clip from a 2018 film called Sorry to Bother You that I think has kind of a fun and interesting way of thinking about communication accommodation. So this comes from Howard Giles, who is a professor of communication at University of California, Santa Barbara, and is very interested in the ways that we process, modify, and change the ways that we communicate with other people. This theory brings about a variety of assumptions about how we choose to communicate, right? This idea, first of all, that there are similarities and dissimilarities in how we choose to communicate and relate to other people, right? We can think to one of the biggest ones, language, and the idea of speaking a different language, meaning that there are significant barriers in the translation process and navigating all of those things. But we can think about even within the same language, something like an accent based on our location, our cultural background, and so on. The topics or ideas that we choose to communicate with other people. For example, do you call it soda? Do you call it pop? Is it pecan? Is it pecan? Right? Those are some of the differences in our own language use, but also a lot of differences in how we make sense of and understand each other's language. Right? We can think about how, for instance, something like eye contact or body language is perceived differently depending on culture. For instance, in some cultures, shaking your head actually indicates yes, while nodding means no. And that type of difference can be a really major problem in understanding how we communicate with each other. So if we all speak differently, which is pretty obvious, then the way that we perceive how other people communicate and what we see from other people is going to impact how we understand a conversation, right? In other words, there's a distinction between like intentionality and impact in how we communicate. That is, perhaps we're intending to come across as friendly and welcoming, but maybe we come off as a little bit intimidating or scared, right? The way that we're choosing to communicate might be different than how other people are picking up on our communication. It's the same reason that we hate hearing our own voice when we hear ourselves being recorded. How we think we're communicating and how we actually sound when we play it back are two very different things. And this idea here too is that language and behaviors provide us with information about our social status and group belonging, right? So how we choose to communicate not only is important to understand meaning, but conveys and shares a part of ourselves and our own experiences to other people. Again, things such as your accent, your tone of voice, the way that you choose to talk about topics, all of that information is a part of the disclosure process. We can think back to some of the communication theories that are interpersonal in nature, things such as uncertainty reduction theory and social penetration theory, right? And those theories tell us what it is that motivates us to communicate. And the idea, the more we talk to other people, the more of us that they see in what we directly tell them and also what they pick up on through our process of understanding and hearing us over and over. I'm sure there are a lot of tics and things that I do that you probably picked up on over time. So this idea of accommodation, right? One kind of practical way of thinking about the idea of accommodation is to think about the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, otherwise known as the ADA, right? The ADA was codified and passed by George H.W. Bush and means that in order to prevent discrimination in the workforce, an employer has to provide reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability. It's also a reason why if you've ever had to fill out an accommodation through EOU and the Disability Services Office, that you're able to do so, right? This idea of accommodation was a major shift from previous models of thinking about disability that were very focused on institutionalization and social isolation. Rather than that, the idea of modifying or changing the current landscape and current world was seen as a better alternative. For example, there's what's known as curb cutting, where on sidewalk curbs, there's a slope which allows wheelchair users to get up and onto the curb. That's an example of an accommodation that's been provided over the last few decades, right? So accommodation, if we're thinking about it in that context, in a general way, means that we're adjusting and changing our own world to meet the needs and concerns of others, right? And oftentimes accommodation relates to meeting in the middle in sort of a compromised way, right? It's regulating our behavior in response to somebody else. So for instance, I was involved in competitive debate, and one thing that we did was talk very, very quickly in our debate rounds, because the idea was that the faster you talked, the more arguments you could get out in that very short period of time, right? So that accommodation and change was sort of in response to needing to do so. This also builds on social identity theory, right? So a lot of theories and other ideas inform this one. We can think back to things such as theories related to self-disclosure, right? Or as we'll talk about next week, about relational dialectics. This idea here that our self-concept is both personal and social. One way of thinking about this is to think about who am I? I know who I am through difference. I know who I am because I know who I'm not, right? To say, for instance, you know, I am white or I am 30, right, is to contrast that with something that I'm not, right? In the same way, we feel self-concept at a personal level, stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. For instance, I am a chronic procrastinator, right? And in a social context, I'm a more introverted person, would be an example of thinking about this at a social identity level as well. Additionally, social identity theory suggests that we cultivate those two elements, who we are personally and who we are in relationship to other people, as we think about in-group and out-groups. In-groups being the groups in which you feel included, participated in a sense of belonging. For instance, if you're involved in athletics, clubs, or activities on campus that you find yourself really closely tied to, that could be your in-group. And out-groups are specifically organizations, groups, cliques, social circles that you find yourself not really relating to or having a whole lot of common, right? So for instance, a lot of the very like preppy people at my high school who were wearing Abercrombie and Fitch and stuff all the time were an out-group for me. I was like the nerdy kid in sweatpants and like a silly button-up shirt. So that type of contrast is something we think about in our relationships. And then as Haley was alluding to, and we'll be talking about a little bit more, there's this idea of divergence and convergence at play too, right? We can think about convergence, right, as two lines coming together, trying to intersect. We can think about divergence as the opposite, right? Two lines moving in the opposite direction. Convergence means that we are trying to more closely match how we communicate to other people. So for instance, it might involve going to a new country and trying to learn the language. It could also mean that you are speaking loudly in order to communicate to somebody with hearing difficulties, right? Divergence is the opposite. And divergence is an intentional effort to try to maintain your own manner of speaking and communicating without trying to change how somebody else does it. And a lot of times we might think that divergence might be disrespectful or rude, right? But there are also contexts in which retaining your method of communication is important. For instance, the idea of retaining a native language and allowing the language to stay alive is something that a lot of Indigenous communities see as a major concern and feel the need to diverge and oftentimes continue to practice that language. We can also think about divergence as a sense of pride or cultural belonging, right? You might have strong opinions about whether it's soda or pop or pecan or pecan based on your own cultural upbringing and how you choose to use language. So there are contexts and situations where divergence can be respectful and can be a way that we try to maintain our own identity in our relationships, right? Sometimes we feel worried about being lost if we over-accommodate our communication. Additionally, accommodation relates to our perception, right? How we pick up on and make sense of our experiences related to other people. So perception is how we make sense of and judge what cues and information we receive that lets us change our own communication strategies. We can also think about things such as norms or expectations, right? For instance, you might notice that as you're talking to somebody, they seem like they're having a hard time paying attention, or it seems like they're really squinting their eyes. And you realize maybe I'm talking too quickly or I'm talking too quietly, or maybe they like come up close to you so that they can get their ear closer to you. So we visually pick up on that. We can hear what other people are saying, and we use things like body language. If somebody seems really stressed out and running, and their voice is kind of wavering, right? We might realize that they are feeling stressed out, and we choose to change the subject or give them some space, right? Remember, nonverbal communication is huge. It's a big part of how we communicate, and we're more likely to trust nonverbal than verbal communication. Somebody says, I'm fine, but they seem like they're really anxious and they're pulling at their hair, right? We're more likely to interpret them as anxious rather than fine. So those elements of how we accommodate and change our communication are things that we pick up on with our senses, and this theory helps us to understand how we gather information. For example, perhaps one norm is maybe you're in a household where you do a prayer prior to having a meal, right? That would be a norm where you might accommodate to change your communication. If you're visiting a family that did that, even though you yourself don't do that before a meal, you might accommodate and participate in an effort to show support for that family. So we've talked a little bit about convergence and divergence, the idea that we make an effort to find similarities in how we communicate relative to another person. We do it both to show support for the person and also to make sure that we're being understood properly and clearly, right? Convergence is useful to us because we know, if we think all the way back to the beginning of the term, right, about those three models of communication, we know that there is noise that impacts and distorts how a message is received. It's not one-to-one. What's in our heads and what another person understands is never going to be quite full. So one challenge then is this idea of over-accommodation, right? So while we might accommodate to show respect for others, we can also take the other extreme and radically adjust our communication to such an extent that it comes across as disrespectful or strange, right? So one example is many members of the disability community, including many people who use wheelchairs, actually dislike it if people bend over when they're speaking, right? Doing like what this person is doing here, where they're like bending over and talking to somebody in a wheelchair. In fact, most people with wheelchairs prefer if you just remain in your position, like you remain standing and you just move your head and neck, right? The reason for that is that the process of like bending your knees and trying to get down to a lower level can feel infantilizing, right? It can feel like how you typically talk to a young child. And there's sort of a long history of folks with disabilities being infantilized and feeling a lot of pushback with that, right? So that might be an example of over accommodation. You don't need to bend down. There's no like purpose behind that, but it might come as a miscommunication between what somebody wants and what that person is thinking with good intentions that they're trying to do, right? One of the challenges with over accommodation is that it oftentimes comes with good intention. And so one of the challenges, right, is navigating the impact of unintentional over accommodation. One idea here is sensory over accommodation, right? Sensory is perceiving that somebody has a limitation in how they choose to speak, and therefore trying to change the way that you communicate with that. For example, you see that somebody has an accent, or somebody, it seems like English is not that person's first language, and you decide to talk extremely slowly to that person. That could be offensive if that person was following along and understanding just fine and assumes that they weren't able to understand the conversation, right? So that can be one element of over accommodation. Another is dependent over accommodation, right? Dependency being this idea that we put a listener in a subservient role, right? One thing that's been talked about a lot, and a word that's been used a lot over the last couple of years, is the concept of gaslighting, right? The idea of intentionally causing somebody to doubt or not understand their own senses. One of the ways that that's used as a tactic is if somebody says something or they make a noise and they intentionally say, oh, I didn't hear anything, or I didn't say anything, right? It's a method of trying to get somebody else to question or doubt their own sensory understanding of something, right? That would be an example of using dependency over accommodation by putting somebody in a role where they're doubting their own senses. And then there's what's known as intergroup over accommodation, right? So intergroup over accommodation is oftentimes associated with stereotypes and particularly can be in dicey territory when it's in regards to things such as race, right? So by saying, you all know this, right? Or assuming somebody is good or bad at something on the basis of something like race or gender, right? That would be an intergroup over accommodation, where you're making this broad category about a group of people and therefore assuming how people would respond to or address something in a way that wouldn't be reasonable, right? There are cues and information that we can all pick up on. For example, example, Haley's point about how we're all college students and therefore would understand prereqs, that would not be an over accommodation because that's information we know, right? And that would be a good example of convergence, but assuming in a large group of people, like at a grocery store, that they're all college students, that would not necessarily fit. So communication accommodation theory has some critique, and talk a little bit about this. One of the critiques is this idea of scope, and that it's this idea that a conversation changes over time, right? So the way that over accommodation is being talked about, or the whole process of communication accommodation, assumes that in any given conversation that we're in different modes, where we're similar, or maybe we're talking differently, and so on. But if we actually chart a conversation, for example, if you're out on a first date or you're having a conversation with a friend for the first time, there's a good chance that your accommodation is going all over the place and maybe converging over the course of that conversation. For instance, you're starting to talk to somebody and you're talking very quickly because you're excited. You realize that they're kind of calm and they're having a little bit of trouble understanding what you have to say. And maybe as the conversation continues, you settle down a bit, you speak a little bit more slowly, and then the other person speeds up and talks more quickly as they get to know you better. If we think back to uncertainty reduction theory, as we know people better, we tend to express ourselves more non-verbally too. So the idea here is that accommodation changes in a conversation as we get more information and as dynamics shift, right? So this theory does not necessarily get at the ways that our manner of speaking and accommodating really fluctuates as the conversation takes place. Another critique is that this is too reliant on a rational model of communicating, right? Again, the rational world paradigm, a rational way of thinking about communication, is this idea that we are making decisions that are best or most beneficial to us. In other words, we're choosing to communicate based on how we can best get our needs met and respect the other person. But there are some situations where that doesn't make sense, where we aren't even thinking about changing how we're speaking to address the needs of somebody else. We're just using our normal voice and so on, right? This question about whether or not humans are rational decision makers, that's a question that is in everything between sociology, economics, health, and communication. And then this other idea here we brought up is this idea of complex conversations. One example of this is if you're having a conversation with a variety of different people with different backgrounds and perspectives. What would it mean, for instance, if you were talking about a soccer game and you were talking about it, and in the audience you had a teammate, but you also had somebody that knew nothing about soccer? You might shift and switch the person you're talking to, the way you talk about it. You might provide a little bit of context and background information. Oftentimes when we're juggling a lot of different people that we have to communicate with and appeal to, our communication strategies are going to adjust and change a little bit, right? That's why oftentimes in a lot of larger public addresses, something like an annual State of the Union address, there's oftentimes very specific communication that's designed to try to appeal to very different groups who have very opposing viewpoints, right? And the goal here being to engage with that complexity in accommodating a variety of groups. So CAT is useful, but things start to get messy. CAT has some difficulty keeping up with the messiness of our conversations. So I want to show a kind of fun example. It's a 2018 film called Sorry to Bother You. And in the film, the main character is working at a call center, right? The idea is at the call center, most of the people that pick up the phone are kind of like white, wealthy, corporate elite types. And so kind of as a stylistic, kind of humorous choice, the main character has what he's told to share as a white voice, which he alters his method of communicating to try to better appeal to the interests and needs of the people that he is talking to on the phone.
Hey, young bro, let me give you a tip. Use your white voice. I ain't got no white voice. Now, come on, you know what I mean. You have a white voice in there. You can use it. It's like when you pulled over by the police. Oh, no, I just use my regular voice when that happens. I just say, back the fuck up off the car and don't nobody get out of it. I'm just trying to give you some game. You want to make some money here? Then read the script in white voice. Well, people say I talk with a white voice anyway, so why ain't it helping me out? Well, you don't talk white enough. I'm not talking about Will Smith, right? I'm talking about the real deal. Like this young man.
Hey, Mr. Kramer, this is Langston from Regal View. I didn't catch you at the wrong time, did I?
So it plays with a lot of our stereotypes and expectations, obviously, right? I think a lot of times, right, we do generalizations about how different folks speak, but there's this like question of obviously having to accommodate or account for a different situation and the norms or expectations of communication, right? And talking to like people in a call center who might be primarily white in the audience, there's this, hey, if you make these adjustments, people are more likely to take you seriously, right? Accounting for both some of the stereotypes that we might attribute to a variety of methods of communicating and also an effort to try to provide accommodation on the basis of communication too. This also ties to this idea of code switching. So code switching is a concept that has come up in a lot of discussions surrounding culture and communication. Code switching is the idea that people will dramatically alter or change the way they speak, including language, depending on the situation or context. A good example of this are people who are bilingual. Oftentimes, right, if somebody speaks, for instance, both English and Spanish, they might speak Spanish more in a kind of family context and might choose to speak English more in a professional context. And in switching between those languages, there's a lot that's different in terms of culture, experience, representation, and so on. So some of those differences there in how people are communicating and adjusting their communication for the moment are important for us to think about. So to kind of wrap up the things that we've talked about for today, and since Friday will end a little bit early, we talked a little bit about that second application paper and some examples of ways that you can prepare for that. Again, that's coming up on the 25th. We talked a little bit about how communication accommodation theory is about how we adjust and alter the methods that we use to communicate and relate to other people. And then we also talked about how culture, context, and meaning that might be attributed to different experiences relate to this theory as well. We have another trio of theories coming up next week. The first of which is known as relational dialectics. This ties back to our own interpersonal communication and relationships in a cultural context. So look forward to that for next week. Have a great weekend. Feel free to pass forward or email me your prompt for today if you haven't already done so. And I will talk to you again for next week.